The house still stands. Its timbers creak beneath the weight of memory. Those who enter seldom speak of what they hear at night. Welcome back. Before we continue, like, subscribe, share. The year is 1888, and the countryside of southern Arkansas carries a silence heavier than most will admit. Dust settles thick along the long dirt road that winds into Hickory Hollow, a settlement no more than a scatter of farmsteads and a church whose bell had not been rung in months. In those fields the crops leaned dull and brittle, as though even the land had grown weary of what it had witnessed. At the center of this silence stood the Dunham residence, a two-story house raised with ambition but darkened by neglect. Its shutters hung crooked, and moss swam up its stone foundation. To any passerby, the Dunham family projected the image of discipline and wealth, well-tended livestock, barns sealed tight, the father Ezekiel Dunham always in his Sunday black, and his son Matthew Dunham stoic, obedient, a young man carved from his father's severity. But those who knew better understood that the Dunhams carried a peculiar reputation. Whispers passed through the community long before the marriage in question, long before tragedy would cement their story into something closer to folklore than fact. The whispers spoke of a family given to secrecy, of Ezekiel's harsh hand in both house and church, and of the strange way his kin seemed bound to him as though tethered by fear more than blood. It was in that year, 1888, that Matthew Dunham returned from a brief apprenticeship in Little Rock, bringing with him a woman he intended to marry. Her name was Clara Whitford, daughter of a modest but respectable grocer in town. She was no heiress, no figure of fortune, but her beauty was a kind that unsettled rather than soothed, pale, watchful, with hair the color of winter wheat, and a voice that could still a room without raising above a whisper. At first the match seemed to please the settlement. The Dunhams were not known for kindness, yet Clara's presence softened Matthew's manner. Neighbors reported seeing him smile for the first time in years. Children who had once feared Ezekiel's son found themselves drawn to Clara's gentle hand. For a short season, Hickory Hollow held its breath in cautious hope that this union might reform the family's shadowed name. But Ezekiel did not smile, not at the betrothal, not at the preparations, and least of all at Clara herself. His gaze upon her was not that of a father welcoming a bride for his son. It was heavier, unblinking, the look of a man studying something that belonged to him by right, though he had no claim. Neighbors would later recall the dinners at the Dunham house in those weeks before the wedding. Ezekiel would sit at the head of the table, eyes fixed upon Clara with a stillness that unsettled the others. His questions were not those of courtesy but of ownership, about her upbringing, her faith, her strength, her loyalty. Clara, polite and unwavering, answered with quiet grace. Yet more than one guest remarked afterward that Ezekiel seemed less interested in her words than in the cadence of her voice, the curve of her jaw, the way her hands folded at her lap. Matthew noticed, though he did not dare speak of it. His obedience to his father had been his burden since childhood, and he had never before resisted. But with Clara near him, the silence weighed differently. What he had once endured as duty now pressed against him as humiliation. For the first time Matthew's loyalty faltered. The marriage was set for October, in the church at Hickory Hollow. Preparations stirred the quiet town to life. Hymns rehearsed, pews scrubbed, and Clara fitted into a gown borrowed from her aunt. Yet rumors began to run alongside the excitement, whispering that Ezekiel himself had taken charge of many details, what food would be served, what songs sung, even the placement of the bride and groom upon the altar. It is as though he plans the ceremony for himself, one woman murmured to another, careful that her children did not hear. The tension broke in the week before the wedding. A farmhand whose name history has left unrecorded claimed to have passed by the Dunham barn late at night and heard voices within. Clara's voice, low and strained, Ezekiel's commanding. There had been no sound of Matthew. When pressed by others, the farmhand refused to repeat what words he thought he heard, only that they were not fitting for a bride and her father-in-law. His testimony, spoken in hushed tones, spread swiftly among the settlement. Matthew himself seemed altered in those final days. The vigor that had carried him through courtship drained into pallor. He was seen walking the fields alone at dawn, fists clenched, jaw tight. Clara, too, appeared diminished, her eyes downcast, her hands trembling in ways she tried to disguise. But when asked, she said nothing against the Dunhams, insisting only that she was well and that the wedding would proceed as planned. The wedding did proceed. On a dim October afternoon, With leaves scattering across the dirt road, Clara walked the aisle in her borrowed gown. Yet those who were present never forgot the sight of Ezekiel Dunham standing just behind his son, closer than custom allowed, his hand resting firm upon Matthew's shoulder. His eyes never left Clara, not once, not even as the vows were spoken. By nightfall, Hickory Hollow would whisper that something had passed at that altar, not a blessing, but a theft, and though the words were sealed in prayer and scripture, the union that followed would unravel into something darker than any had dared to imagine. The Dunham story begins, as all tragedies do, with what seemed an ordinary sin, envy in the heart of a father. Yet envy has its own inheritance, and once sown, it does not lie fallow. This is only the beginning. The wedding was spoken of for weeks, though not with the warmth a new union should bring. Hickory Hollow's church pews had been full that October day, yet those who gathered left the ceremony with unease coiled around their throats. Something was amiss, though few could name it without risking scandal. In the records of the town clerk, now faded with age, the account is plain. On the 14th day of October 1888, Matthew Dunham, son of Ezekiel Dunham, was joined in holy matrimony to Miss Clara Whitford, daughter of Edward Whitford, in accordance with law and scripture. Nothing in the ledger betrays what witnesses carried home in whispers: that the bride's voice faltered when she was asked to repeat her vows, that the groom's hands shook so fiercely he nearly dropped the ring, and that Ezekiel's eyes remained fixed upon Clara, as though the exchange of promises bound him as well. The first weeks of marriage settled into a strange rhythm. Clara and Matthew moved into a small room at the Dunham residence, upstairs beneath the eave. It was customary for newlyweds to begin in their own household, yet Ezekiel insisted they remain under his roof. "The land is in my name," he said. "Until it is secure, you belong here." None dared question him, least of all Matthew, who had never known life apart from his father's governance. At dawn, Clara would rise to tend to the hearth, only to find Ezekiel already seated in the parlor, waiting. His greetings were courteous, but his presence never softened. He asked after her sleep, her health, her thoughts, questions spoken with such precision they felt more like measurements than concern. Clara answered politely, though her voice grew thinner by the day. Neighbors began to notice changes in the young bride. Her once bright countenance dimmed, her cheeks hollowed, and though she moved about her duties, her steps carried a weight that no gown of muslin could explain. Rumors multiplied that Ezekiel lingered too long in the doorway of her chamber, that his hand brushed hers at the table not in accident but in intent, that his shadow fell between her and Matthew even when her husband stood close. Matthew too altered. The obedience that had marked his youth curdled into something darker, resentment sharpened by impotence. He had never dared defy his father, and now, with Clara beneath the same roof, he found himself not husband but rival. His affection for her, once tender, became tangled with shame. Neighbors spoke of seeing him pace the fields long into the night, muttering as though in conversation with some unseen presence. In December of 1888, a visiting cousin from Little Rock recorded in a private letter an incident that would later prove significant. She wrote, "I witnessed a scene most unnatural. At supper, Mr. Ezekiel Dunham demanded that Clara sit at his right, displacing Matthew to the far end of the table. The father carved the meat himself and placed it upon her plate with such ceremony as might befit a queen. Clara did not raise her eyes. Matthew said nothing. The silence was so complete I feared to breathe. Letters such as these were never meant for public eyes, yet they survive, preserved in attics and trunks as though the family's shame refused to decay with the passing year. Each record testifies not merely to impropriety, but to the systematic dismantling of boundaries that should have held fast between father and son. By early 1889, Hickory Hollow no longer disguised its suspicion. In hushed voices after Sunday service, the townsfolk exchanged fragments of what they thought they knew. A seamstress claimed Clara confided in her of unwanted attentions from within the household. A farmhand reported seeing Ezekiel and Clara walking the fields together at dusk, too close for comfort. Another swore he overheard an argument between father and son, ending with the sharp crack of a hand across flesh. Yet none dared confront Ezekiel openly. His reputation in the church, his wealth in land and livestock, and his command of scripture made him untouchable. To accuse him was to risk one's standing in the community. Thus the whispers remained whispers, and the Dunham house continued as though sealed against reproach. Within its walls, however, the tension grew unendurable. Clara's attempts at resistance were subtle, her refusals disguised as obedience, her silences meant as barriers, but Ezekiel was patient. Where Matthew faltered in courage, his father pressed forward with certainty. Ezekiel read scripture aloud at night, passages of wives' submission, of patriarchal rule, bending holy words into instruments of possession. Clara, cornered by both piety and law, endured. Matthew's torment reached its height in the spring. One night after the household had retired, a servant claimed to hear raised voices from the upper chamber. Clara's sobs were muffled. Ezekiel's tone was low and commanding. Matthew burst forth soon after, his face bruised, his fists bleeding. He vanished into the barn until dawn. The servant dared not speak of what he had seen until years later, when the Dunham name no longer carried weight. By the middle of 1889, Clara was with child. The news should have brought joy, yet it carried dread, for while Matthew declared himself the father, the community whispered otherwise. The timing, the resemblance of glances, the way Ezekiel's posture shifted when the news was spoken, all fed suspicion that could not be named aloud. The truth of paternity was never proven, but from that moment the marriage ceased to be a bond between Matthew and Clara. It became a crucible of shame. Matthew, consumed by doubt, withdrew further into silence. Clara, though she carried life within her, grew frail as if each day drained her strength rather than nourished it. And Ezekiel, he seemed invigorated, striding the fields with new pride, preaching sermons of obedience and divine order with renewed fervor. In the journals of Dr. Samuel Briggs, the town physician, one finds a curious entry dated June 1889. Symptoms of fatigue, paleness, fainting, fits, husband silent during consultation, father-in-law unusually attentive, spoke on her behalf, would not leave the room, patient's eyes filled with tears though no words passed her lips. I advised rest, left the house unsettled. Such records do not tell the whole, but they paint the edges of a portrait too grim to deny. What began as whispers now hardened into suspicion, and though the Dunhams maintained their outward dignity, the truth lay festering within those walls, awaiting the moment when concealment would no longer hold. By the winter of 1889, the household was already unraveling. Though Ezekiel carried himself with authority in the settlement, within the walls of his home the arrangement had grown untenable. Clara's condition worsened, her fainting spells increased, and her once luminous presence dimmed into a husk of the girl who had first walked Hickory Hollow's eye. When the child was born in January of 1890, a son, his arrival was met not with the joy of kinship, but with the heavy hush of speculation. Some remarked upon the shape of the child's jaw, his piercing gray eyes, features too aligned with Ezekiel to be dismissed. Others pointed instead to Matthew's likeness, desperate to shield the family name from suspicion, but no one spoke openly, not in that town, not against that man. Clara named the infant Jonah, though Ezekiel insisted he should carry his own name. The quarrel ended with compromise. Jonah, Ezekiel Dunham. The child's christening was held in the same church that had borne witness to the ill-fated wedding, though many in the pews kept their eyes lowered, unwilling to look upon Ezekiel as he held the child more firmly than the father did. Matthew by then was scarcely more than a shadow himself. His nights were spent at the edge of the fields, whiskey bottle in hand, his voice low and muttering to the soil. A neighbor once found him kneeling in the mud, whispering prayers for deliverance not to God, but to the earth itself. His hands clawed the dirt as though searching for answers beneath the surface. It was in this climate that the first accident occurred. In March of 1890, a stable hand employed by the Dunhams was discovered lifeless in the barn, his neck broken beneath a fallen beam. Officially, it was recorded as structural collapse, yet the beam had long been secure, and those who knew the building claimed no rot or weakness had threatened it. Whispers spread that the man had overheard something, an exchange between Ezekiel and Clara, or perhaps between father and son, and that the accident had silenced him. Briggs, in his notes, recorded a private suspicion, the stable hand's injuries too precise, as though placed rather than caused by fall. Spoke to Matthew the day prior, who was in agitation. Could this be connected to the Dunham troubles? Dare not commit more to pay. Such caution in record-keeping reflects the fear Ezekiel inspired. Even suspicion could not be fully written. It had to live between the lines. As Jonah grew, so too did the child cried incessantly at night, his wails echoing through the timbered halls until servants begged to be dismissed. Some claimed he would not settle until Ezekiel himself entered the room. Others whispered that Clara avoided the cradle, her face pale whenever she neared. To bear a child is burden enough, but to bear one under such shadow, whether by force, by fear, or by both,
is to carry a curse not easily shaken. The year 1890 thus became one of mounting dread. Matthew's disintegration worsened. He spoke less to Clara, less to anyone at all. His resentment toward his father festered, yet he had neither the courage to confront, nor the will to flee. Townsfolk began to see in him the same haunted aspect they had once seen in Ezekiel's own wife, Matthew's mother, who had died years earlier, under circumstances never fully explained. Some recalled her gaunt figure in the final months, the way her voice dwindled, her eyes hollowed. The resemblance was undeniable. It was said that Ezekiel kept her journals locked in his study, pages that no one had seen but him. Whether Clara ever glimpsed them is unknown. Those servants swore they caught her once in that room, standing before the locked cabinet with her hand upon the drawer. She turned away when footsteps approached. By late summer of 1890, Clara herself seemed determined to act. A seamstress named Helen Graves testified decades later that Clara, during a fitting, pressed her hand and whispered, "Do not trust the house, do not trust the man who owns it. He will take everything you give." Helen, frightened, never repeated the words until long after the Dunhams were gone. Yet whatever plans Clara nurtured, they did not come to fruition. In September, she collapsed without warning during supper. Dr. Briggs was summoned at once. His account is chilling.
Mrs. Clara Dunham seized by sudden illness, convulsions violent, lips foaming, body stiffened. Administered laudanum in vain. After an hour, episode subsided. Patient weak but alive. Suspect poisoning, though source unclear. Household disturbed yet father-in-law unusually calm. The suspicion of poison was never pursued. Ezekiel insisted it was a mere female ailment, a faintness of constitution. The community, bound by fear and propriety, did not question him, but those closest to Clara noticed her food was often served directly from Ezekiel's hand, her plate chosen by him before others. Matthew remained paralyzed. Whatever doubts or rage burned within him did not translate into protection for his wife. His silence condemned him as surely as Ezekiel's actions. Neighbors began to pity Clara openly, though pity was all they dared extend. Autumn closed in. The trees bent heavy with dying leaves, and the air grew sharp. Clara's health continued to falter. Her cheeks hollowed further, her hands trembled, and her eyes, once vivid with resistance, dulled into resignation. Jonah, still an infant, wailed through the nights, his cries now carrying an uncanny rhythm, as though echoing the cadence of a voice not his own. Then, on November 3, 1890, Clara vanished. Her absence was explained as sudden travel to visit kin, though no letter had been written, no carriage hired, no witness seen her depart. The Dunham household offered no clarity. Ezekiel, when asked, declared she had taken ill and required rest in seclusion. Matthew said nothing. Weeks passed. Winter pressed down. Clara was not seen again. In the church records an entry appears, dated December 12, 1890. Clara Whitford Dunham, presumed deceased. Cause unrecorded. No body interred. No body. No grave. No farewell. And yet, those who passed the Dunham house at night swore they heard the faint cry of a woman drifting from the upper rooms. Some swore the windows glowed with a light long after the lamps had been extinguished. One child, straying too close, told of a pale face pressed to the glass, lips moving as though in warning. The land remembers, and so did Hickory Hollow. The year turned, and with it the silence deepened. By 1891 the Dunham home was a place most avoided after dusk. Its windows glowed faintly with lamplight, but those who lived nearby swore the house had changed. They said the walls groaned louder than timber should, that voices carried on nights when no visitors were known to call. Matthew was by then a ruined man. His youth, once the promise of the family's name, had dissolved into suspicion and whiskey. He rarely ventured into town, and when he did, his steps were unsteady, his words slurred, his eyes bloodshot. Mothers drew their children aside when he passed. He looked no longer like a son robbed of a bride, but a soul robbed of its anchor. What little dignity remained to him was tied to Jonah, the infant who had by then grown into a sharp-eyed toddler. Jonah's likeness to Ezekiel had not softened with time. His features, stern brow, narrow lips, calculating gaze, invited whispers in every church pew and every shop stall. Matthew avoided those stares by keeping the boy close, though the closeness was bitter. To raise one who might not be one's own, yet to love him all the same, was a torment that eroded him daily. Clara's absence remained unexplained. In official record, she was away, though no letter arrived. No family confirmed her presence. No grave was dug. Her disappearance left only questions, and in the absence of answers, rumor swelled. Some believed she had fled, others that she had perished within the house and been hidden. Still others whispered of Ezekiel's hand in it, though none dared to voice such suspicions where he might hear. Briggs, still careful with his pen, noted in his private ledger, Mrs. CWD vanished. November last. Household explanation unsatisfactory. Patient's prior illness strongly suggests poison. Probability high of concealment by patriarch. No proof. God forgive me, I write only for truth. Though truth may never be heard, the ledger would remain hidden until his death. In April of 1891, calamity returned. A neighbor's son, no more than 15, wandered too close to the Dunham property. His body was found in the creek, skull cracked against stone. Ezekiel declared it a fall, though the boy's family whispered he had been struck. They claimed he had seen something, heard something that demanded his silence. The coroner recorded accidental drowning, yet this death marked a turn in community feeling. Hickory Hollow, though still bound by fear, grew uneasy with the pattern. Too many accidents, too much misfortune, too close to the Dunhams. A reputation began to form, one not of tragedy but of curse. Within the house, servants departed one by one. Some cited wages, others sickness. Privately, they admitted they could no longer bear the night. One young girl confided to the local seamstress that she had awoken to find Clara's wedding gown draped across her chair, though it had been locked away since 18. Another insisted she saw muddy footprints leading from Jonah's nursery to the cellar, though no one had entered. By midsummer, only a skeleton staff remained, bound by desperation more than loyalty. The relationship between Ezekiel and his son fractured beyond repair that same year. One night in July of 1891, shouting was heard from within the house, so loud it carried across the field. Neighbors later testified they heard Matthew scream, she was mine, and you took her." What followed was a crash, then silence. By morning, Matthew bore a deep gash above his brow. He explained it away as a stumble. Ezekiel did not speak of it, but Matthew's public collapse was complete. He spent his days in the tavern, muttering about betrayal, about curses, about the house itself being unholy. His words, though slurred, began to find listening ears. For the first time, townsfolk whispered not only behind their hands, but within each other's company. The Dunham power, though still formidable, began to waver under the weight of suspicion. Jonah, meanwhile, grew into a child of uncanny perception. By his third year he spoke little, but when he did, his words were sharp, unsettling. Once when asked where his mother had gone, he replied, "She lives in the dark room. Grandfather visits her." The statement chilled the household. When pressed, Jonah fell silent and would not repeat it. That autumn, another death came. This time it was Thomas Radcliffe, a carpenter hired to repair the collapsing barn where the stable hand had perished. Radcliffe was found impaled upon his own tools, though recorded as mischance. The violence of the injuries suggested otherwise. His widow swore he had confessed unease about the Dunham household, that he had been warned not to pry. By then, Ezekiel's control was tightening. He walked the town less often, his dealings handled in private rather than in public square. His presence grew more spectral, as though he no longer required community approval. He had what he wanted within his own walls, and nothing beyond them could threaten him, or so he believed. Yet the shadows were lengthening. On the night of November 12, 1891, the church sexton swore he saw Clara herself, pale and thin, moving along the edge of the graveyard. Her dress hung torn, her hair unkempt. When he called out, she vanished. He told no one for weeks, fearing madness, but when he did speak, others confessed similar sightings. A woman's figure, pale at the window, a faint song in the orchard, a weeping heard beneath the floorboards of the church itself. Whether ghost or rumor, the figure of Clara returned, and with her the certainty that the Dunham story was not closed but festering. The year ended with another entry in Dr. Briggs's ledger, the last before his hand grew too feeble. The Dunham case beyond redemption. The son dissolves, the patriarch thrives, the bride erased, the child uncertain, each death more suspicious than the last, each silence heavier. The hollow itself feels altered, as though the soil drinks what the law refuses. I fear what legacy shall grow here. Briggs died in the spring of 18. He was buried on the ridge, his records sealed within a trunk, but his unease remained, carried by those who had seen too much, heard too much, and yet spoken too little. And within the Dunham home, something darker still was stirring, something not satisfied with silence, nor with secrecy. By 1892, the Dunham household had become less a home than a citadel of silence. Its shutters were drawn, its doors bolted, and only a few dared cross its threshold. Yet for all the secrecy, the whispers in Hickory Hollow spread like mildew, growing, clinging, impossible to scrub clean. It was in that year that the first attempts were made to record the family's decline in the language of science, rather than superstition. The newly arrived physician, Dr. Horace Leland, a man younger and more daring than Dr. Briggs had been, believed he could pierce the veil. Where Briggs had chronicled doubts in a guarded hand, Leland sought to make a study, an anatomy not of flesh but of legacy. He wrote in his opening memorandum, preserved in faded ink, "The Dunham line exhibits patterns of affliction which defy ordinary cause. The patriarch thrives while his progeny wither, wives vanish, sons decay, offspring emerge, touched with strange precocity. Inbreeding has been suggested, though evidence eludes. I suspect both hereditary weakness and unnatural influence. Investigation required." Thus began the Dunham file, a series of notes and diagrams meant to trace what Leland considered a case of familial degeneration. Matthew was his first subject. By then 28, he bore the outward signs of premature ruin. His hair had thinned to patches, his teeth were blackened from spirits, and his speech carried both desperation and menace. Leland visited him at the tavern, claiming the guise of physicianly concern. The conversation transcribed reads, "Leland, Mr. Dunham, do you suffer pains in the head or the chest?" Matthew, "Pain, sir. I suffer theft. I suffer betrayal. My bride stolen. My child corrupted. There is no pain beyond that." Leland, "And your health?" Matthew, "Health is nothing when a man is hollow. Ask my father what health he has taken. Ask him where Clara lies." Here the transcript breaks. Matthew refused further questions, lapsing into curses and weeping. Yet Leland noted tremors in the hands, discolored skin, and a peculiar dilation of the eyes at mention of his father. Jonah was Leland's second subject. Though only 4, he exhibited traits that disturbed the physician deeply. He did not play as other children did. He arranged objects in patterns, stones, bones, fragments of cloth, then stared at them for hours. He mimicked voices with unsettling accuracy, repeating not only words but the tones of those long days. Once in the doctor's presence, he repeated Clara's lullaby, though no one had sung it in years. When asked where he had learned it, Jonah smiled faintly and said, "She hums it in the floor." Leland wrote with unease, "Child displays prodigious memory, morbid fixation, absence of ordinary warmth. He regards father with suspicion, grandfather with unnatural loyalty, a phenomenon not of innocence but of inheritance, as though one man's will might reside within another's blood." The phrase "unnatural loyalty" would recur throughout the file. Ezekiel himself allowed Leland only one interview. By then the patriarch was nearing 60, yet bore none of the frailty of age. His body remained strong, his eyes cold and commanding. When Leland inquired after his health, Ezekiel replied with mockery, "I have no ailments, doctor. It is others who weaken. Perhaps they lack my resolve. Perhaps God has chosen." Leland pressed him on Clara, on the rumors, on the Ezekiel's reply was chilling in its calmness. "Men die as they are meant. Women vanish when they cannot endure. My house stands. That is all that matters." After that he forbade the doctor's return. Yet Leland was not deterred. He began gathering testimonies from neighbors, servants, tradesmen, any who had seen or heard fragments. One maid swore she had found locks of Clara's hair in Ezekiel's desk, bound with red twine. A blacksmith claimed he had sold the patriarch chains heavier than any used for livestock. A midwife whispered that Jonah bore a mark at birth, 3 faint ridges upon his shoulder, like fingers pressed into flesh. All these reports Leland compiled, convinced the case represented more than coincidence. In the margins of his file, he scribbled a word he dared not publish openly, atavism. By it he meant not only the return of traits from earlier generations, but something darker, a reversion to a more primal predatory order, where father devoured son, and bloodlines twisted inward. Meanwhile Matthew's unraveling accelerated. He spoke openly in taverns of murder, of his father's abominations, of a marriage that should never have been sanctified. His words grew more desperate, his claims more grotesque. Once he stood upon the tavern table and shouted, "He lies with her still, my bride. In the cellar he keeps her. I hear her knock.
The townsfolk recoiled, but some began to wonder. Too many vanishings, too much secrecy, even madness bore seeds of In August of 1892, Matthew was found wandering the fields at midnight, shirt torn, hands bloodied. He claimed he had dug where Clara lay, yet no grave was discovered, only churned earth and broken nails. He was confined to his room for weeks, Ezekiel barring all visitors. Leland attempted to see him, but was turned away at gunpoint. It was during this confinement that the most damning entry in Leland's file appeared. A servant girl dismissed from the Dunham house came to the doctor, trembling. She swore she had heard voices beneath the floorboards, not one but two, murmuring at night. She insisted she had seen a figure in white descend into the cellar, led by Ezekiel's hand. When asked if it could have been Clara, the girl wept and would not answer. By year's end, the community of Hickory Hollow was divided. Some still revered Ezekiel's authority, unwilling to accuse a man of his standing. Others, emboldened by Matthew's ravings and Leland's quiet questions, began to whisper of petitioning the sheriff. Yet no action was taken. Fear prevailed, as it always had, and so the house remained closed, its windows shuttered, its secrets festering. But within those walls, something was shifting. Jonah, now old enough to wander freely, was said to have been seen in the churchyard at night, speaking to stone. He returned with soil beneath his nails, and once with a fragment of bone. When scolded, he replied with words too old for his mouth. The ground remembers, we are only what it feeds. Dr. Leland wrote in despair, the child is both heir and echo. The sins of the father are not only taught but inscribed. This is no ordinary inheritance, it is contagion, a legacy of silence and blood, festering beneath the hollow soil. Thus ended the 5th year of torment, and with it, the faint hope of deliverance. For the Dunham name no longer belonged to men of flesh and choice. It belonged to something older, something that fed upon them, and through them, upon the hollow itself. By the spring of 1893, Hickory Hollow had resigned itself to living beneath the shadow of the Dunhamists. The fields still bloomed, the church bells still rang, but life seemed drained of its former warmth. Farmers whispered that their cattle grew leaner, that milk soured quicker, that even the soil yielded crops with a bitter taste. All of this, they said, was tied to that house on the rise. Inside, the Dunham story moved into darker corridors. Dr. Horace Leland, though warned off by Ezekiel himself, persisted in his record. Where the town kept its silence, the physician sought its truth, and what he wrote in the spring of that year remains the most disturbing portion of his file. He began with Matthew, who by then had slipped into a state between delirium and despair. The younger Dunham spent most days pacing his chamber, scratching upon the walls with bits of broken glass, carving symbols that even Leland could not identify. When the doctor was finally permitted entry, under Ezekiel's reluctant allowance, he found Matthew emaciated, his fingernails gone to the quick, his eyes fever bright. He claims he dreams without rest. Leland wrote, visions of his wife taken below, of his father's hand upon her, of a child, whose blood is not his own. He raves that he hears Clara's voice each night, not from heaven but from the cellar. His body wastes, yet his mind burns with suspicions that may conceal hidden truths. At the foot of Matthew's bed, Leland discovered a small pile of objects, scraps of cloth, buttons, a child's wooden toy. All were damp with soil as though unearthed from shallow ground. When asked how he had acquired them, Matthew laughed and said only, she gives them to me when he sleeps. Jonah, by then 5 years old, had grown stranger still. Servants described his habit of staring into mirrors for long stretches, whispering as though another child stood within. He refused to answer to Matthew, but would come instantly at Ezekiel's call. On one occasion, he was overheard reciting lines from the Psalms, though no one had taught him. His voice in that moment, the cook swore, was not his own but Clara's.
When Leland attempted to examine him, Jonah resisted, biting the physician's hand so sharply the wound festered. Yet the child's expression during the attack was not rage, but calm calculation, as though he had chosen the act to mark territory. This boy, Leland noted, is less a child than a vessel. He carries not only blood, but memory, echoing what he should not know. His lineage is poisoned by secrecy, by sin, perhaps by design. As for Ezekiel, his control over the household remained absolute. He dismissed servants at the slightest disobedience, replacing them with laborers too poor to refuse. Yet even these men left swiftly, muttering of strange drafts in closed rooms, of scratching beneath the floor, of the faint smell of rot that no fire could dispel. One man, before vanishing from town entirely, confided to Leland that he had opened the cellar door one night to fetch wine. In the darkness below, he swore he saw a figure bound to a chair, its head bowed, its hair long and pale. Before he could descend, Ezekiel appeared behind him, silent as a shadow, and ordered him away. The man obeyed, and by dawn he had quit his post. Leland recorded the testimony with trembling hand. By midsummer, Matthew had grown violent. On July 7, 1893, a servant reported that he attempted to force entry into the locked cellar, wielding a hatchet. He was restrained only after Ezekiel himself struck him senseless. For days afterward, Matthew lay unconscious, a bandage across his skull. When he awoke, he spoke no longer in words but in mutters, half prayers and half curses, begging Clara to forgive him for failing her. Leland, desperate to intervene, appealed to the sheriff, but the sheriff, long beholden to Ezekiel's influence, refused. The Dunhams handle their own, was his curt reply. And so the silence of the hollow deepened once again. The autumn brought the most chilling entry in the file. On the night of October 14, 1893, the church bell rang at midnight, though no sexton had pulled its rope. Townsfolk gathered in confusion, only to see Jonah standing barefoot in the churchyard, mud clinging to his nightclothes. When approached, the boy pointed toward the bell tower and whispered, "She waits above." Yet no figure was found in the tower, only the bells swinging faintly as though touched by unseen hands. Leland wrote, "The child appears tethered to presences beyond the living." Whether hallucination or spectral influence, the evidence accumulates that the Dunham house is but the vessel of something deeper, seeping into the hollow itself. Winter closed in harsh and unforgiving. Matthew grew skeletal, his body consuming itself, his voice failing. He left upon the wall a final message, scrawled with blood from his own hand. "He took her from me, and now he takes me too. Do not forget. Do not forgive." Ezekiel ordered the walls scrubbed clean, but the words remained, etched into the minds of all who had seen. In his last entry for that year, Leland wrote with grim certainty, "The Dunham case is no longer medical nor psychological nor even moral. It is contagion. It seeps from father to son, from husband to wife, from soil to seed. The hollow itself is unwell. Unless this lineage is severed, its corruption will endure." What Leland could not know, what none could admit aloud, was that the corruption had already rooted itself too deeply. Clara's voice, whether imagined or real, continued to hum through the wall. Jonah grew more calculating with each passing month, and Ezekiel, untouched by sickness or doubt, watched all unfold with a serenity that seemed less human than sovereign. The year ended in silence, but it was the silence of a storm gathering, heavy with dread, waiting to break. By 1894, the Dunham estate had grown into a subject not merely of gossip, but of dread so profound that neighbors altered their paths to avoid even passing its gates. The house stood like a monument to unspoken crimes, its shutters nailed, its chimneys issuing thin smoke that seemed more signal than warmth. Inside, the rot had reached its crescendo. Matthew Dunham lingered still, though it was plain to all that he was dying. His body was wasted to bone, his skin parchment thin, his voice cracked to whispers. He had once been the pride of his father's house, a son meant to inherit land and name, yet by that year, he resembled more a phantom than a man. Horace Leland, keeping his clandestine watch, described Matthew's decline in chilling terms. "His eyes are sunk, his frame broken, yet his mind, though fevered, holds peculiar clarity when he speaks of Clara. He insists, she lingers near, not as memory but as presence. He hears her steps above his bed, feels her hands against his brow. I cannot say he lies, for when he speaks thus, the air itself chills." Matthew's ravings shifted from grief to warning. He begged the doctor to burn the house before the roots spread. He swore Jonah was not a child but a vessel, a continuation of Ezekiel's sin. He muttered prayers in the night, prayers that collapsed into sobbing. By March, his words fell silent forever. He died in his bed, his body twisted, his eyes wide open. Ezekiel forbade embalming, demanding burial at once, but servants whispered that Matthew's corpse bore bruises at the neck, as though hands had pressed there in his final moments. Jonah, then 6, attended the burial. He did not cry. He He stood beside Ezekiel, small hand in patriarch's palm, his gaze steady upon the open earth. When the coffin was lowered, Jonah whispered something no one caught, but Dr. Leland, watching from the crowd, later recorded, "The child smiled, not with innocence, but with possession." He looked not at the grave, but at his grandfather, as though the coffin was not an end, but a beginning. It was after Matthew's death that the hollow began to suffer calamities beyond the household. Livestock miscarried, wells turned brackish, infants were born weak, or not at all. Some said it was coincidence, others the curse of weather, yet a few dared speak aloud. The Dunhams had poisoned the land. More troubling still were the visions. Several townsfolk claimed to glimpse Clara's figure upon the ridge, pale and thin, her eyes hot. One farmer swore he saw her walking across his field at dawn, dragging her veil behind her, though when he approached, she dissolved into mist. The church itself was not spared. In June, during Sunday service, the pulpit Bible was found marked by a smear of blood across its open page. The passage stained was Ezekiel 16, "Thou hast played the harlot with thy father." The congregation dispersed in silence. Dr. Leland pressed harder with his investigation. He bribed one of the remaining servants to describe what lay beneath the cell. The man confessed in terror that there were rooms below, bricked and damp, where no sunlight reached. Chains hung from the beams, and in one chamber a chair stood, its arms carved with grooves deep as wrists. The servant swore he once heard a woman's moans echo there, though Ezekiel denied it. When Leland asked if the woman could be Clara, the servant fled and never returned. By autumn, Ezekiel grew more withdrawn. He attended no church, spoke to no magistrate, and conducted his affairs from within the house, yet his power remained unshaken. Men who sought to oppose him fell silent, either by fear or by ruin. He seemed untouchable, as though age itself obeyed him. His hair silvered, but his body retained strength enough to labor alongside men half his years. Jonah shadowed him constant. The boy had shed the last of childish softness, his features narrowing into the unmistakable stamp of Ezekiel. He no longer answered to Jonah, but to son. Servants whispered he called Ezekiel father more often than Matthew ever had. One account, written by Leland with visible dread, described Jonah standing before the parlor mirror, reciting a catechism not taught in church. He spoke, "The flesh may rot, but the name endures. The son replaces the father takes the son. The line is one." He repeated it until Ezekiel entered the room, at which point he fell silent. Leland added, "This is no child's invention. It is doctrine passed as surely as scripture." Matthew's grave brought no peace. Within weeks, strange sounds were reported from the cemetery at night, scratching, knocking, the shifting of soil. Twice the grave was found unsettled, earth pushed upward as though from beneath. The caretaker filled it again and again, but the disturbances returned. Leland's private speculation, penned in trembling script, was damning. If Ezekiel buried not a corpse but a captive, then Clara yet suffers. If he buried his son alive, then his evil knows no bounds. Either way, the ground itself resists, rejecting what he has sown. The year closed with one final terror. On the night of December 3rd, townsfolk awoke to the sound of bells. Every bell in Hickory Hollow, from church to schoolhouse to farmhouse handbell, ringing at once though no hand touched them. The sound endured for near half an hour. When silence returned, a single word was found scrawled in chalk upon the church door: "Remember." No one confessed. Many believed the hand was Jonah's, though the boy was scarcely taller than the door itself. Leland's file for that year ends abruptly, his last entry written in a shaking hand: "This house consumes not only its own but all around it." With Matthew gone, the bond between Ezekiel and Jonah strengthened. "I fear the child is no longer child but apprentice, heir to corruption that defies reason. I write these words with trembling, for I sense eyes upon me even now. If I do not survive, let it be known, the hollow is cursed not by accident but by inheritance." After this entry, no further notes appear in the file until the following spring. Some say Leland vanished that winter, others claim he fled, but a handful whispered that he too was taken into the cellar, where names and lineages dissolved into something far older than kinship. And so the story of the Dunhams did not end with Matthew's grave. It only descended further into the roots of the house.
the soil of the hollow and the blood of those who bore the name. By 1895, the Dunham household stood as both fortress and tomb. Its walls sweated with damp, its shutters sealed against every gaze, yet the villagers whispered that within, the patriarch Ezekiel and the boy Jonah had entered into practices that no daylight could abide. The hollow itself seemed poisoned by their dominion. Crops failed in rings nearest the estate, while crows gathered in unnatural numbers on its fence posts. At night the sound of chanting, low, rhythmic and foreign, rolled across the valley, carried by wind that smelled of iron. Those who heard it spoke of sickness afterward, a weakness in the chest, as though the very air conspired against them. Dr. Horace Leland's records resume in the spring of that year, though the entries are fragmented, written in a hand that faltered more with each page. He had not fled, he had not vanished, he remained in Hickory Hollow, consumed by the very investigation that was unraveling his mind. His notes describe an April visit to the Dunham place, arranged under pretense of tending to Jonah's recurring fever. What he found unsettled even his practiced eye. The boy's body shows no illness of flesh, yet his skin bears symbols, marks burned, not inked, into the upper arms. They resemble not letters but diagrams. When I traced them upon paper I discerned a pattern, interlocking circles, joined as though to signify union. He resisted no touch, but gazed at me with serenity that chilled me more than pain would have. Ezekiel claimed the scars came from accident with farm tools, though no farm in the county could explain such geometry. Leland wrote further, the house reeks of mineral damp, though the cellars are said to be dry. In one chamber the air quivered as though heated, though no fire was present. I heard the sound of weeping, distant but constant. Ezekiel ignored it. Jonah smiled. The townsfolk began keeping tally of deaths. Chickens, goats, even dogs dropped without clear cause. Then a young girl, Clara Henley, no kin to Margaret, collapsed in the schoolyard and never rose. A blacksmith bled from his nose until he choked. Both were buried without autopsy, the families preferring silence to scandal. Each funeral was marked by a strange occurrence. At Clara's the church bell tolled 13 times, though the sexton swore he had pulled only 12. At the blacksmith's, the coffin wood split as though struck from within. Suspicion turned inevitably toward the Dunhams, yet Ezekiel's power endured. His business holdings reached into lumber, grain, even law enforcement. None dared accuse him outright. The fear was not only of reprisal but of belief, that to speak the truth of what dwelt in that house, might call it forth. Jonah grew into a boy of 7, but those who saw him swore he bore the demeanor of a man thrice his years. His speech was measured, his eyes ancient. He walked not with play but with solemn purpose, and never far from Ezekiel's side. One servant who lasted mere weeks fled in terror after discovering Jonah seated in the study, reading aloud from Ezekiel's ledger in a voice not his own. She described it as the echo of Matthew, but colder, as though the Son returned not in flesh but in utterance. Her testimony was recorded by Leland, who underlined it twice. The summer brought storms that ravaged the hollow. Lightning struck thrice upon the Dunham house, yet each time the flames smothered themselves before the timbers caught. To the villagers this was proof of unnatural protection. To Leland it was omen. In July he dared confide his suspicions to Margaret Henley, who had long kept her private journal of Ezekiel's crimes. Their letters, preserved in courthouse archives, reveal 2 minds circling the same terror. Margaret wrote, Ezekiel has taken what law and scripture cannot forbid. He calls it lineage, but it is theft of both womb and will. Now the boy bears signs upon his flesh, not of baptism but of ownership. If this be not stopped, the hollow itself shall bear his curse. Leland replied in trembling script, I fear we stand not against man alone, but against the doctrine. They believe what they do is ordained, that the Father may consume the Son replace the Father, until no distinction remain. If this is so, then Matthew's death was no accident, but initiation. Rumors multiplied. Some claimed Clara's ghost, still clothed in her bridal veil, appeared in the fields at dusk, her hands outstretched toward children who wandered too near the hollow's edge. Others spoke of Jonah's laughter ringing from the woods when no child was present. One farmer, Elias Brown, swore he saw Ezekiel and Jonah standing hand in hand in the graveyard, chanting in unison while the soil around Matthew's grave stirred. He told no one but his wife, and within a week, Elias was found hanging from his barn rafter. The death was ruled suicide. His wife fled the county. By autumn, Margaret Henley pressed Leland to act. She urged him to present evidence beyond journals and whispers, yet the doctor hesitated. His own notes betray paralysis. I dread that to accuse is to invite the fate of those who crossed him. The boy watches me now. He greets me with calm words, but his gaze lingers upon my hands as though measuring their strength. I wake to find symbols drawn in dust upon my windowsill, circles joined, lines crossed. I wipe them clean, but each morning they return. The climax of that year came at harvest. The town gathered for the fair. Though joy was sparse, the Dunhams did not attend. Yet at dusk, a sight drove all into silence. Jonah himself, walking barefoot through the square, clad in white though no one had seen him depart the estate. His eyes were blank, his steps steady. He stopped before the church doors and pressed his small hand upon the wood. When he withdrew it, the shape of his palm was seared into the surface as though burned. He said only, "The Father is the Son."
Then he turned and walked back toward the hollow, vanishing into mist before any dared follow. The incident was recorded by no official, yet Leland's notes confirm it, and Margaret's journal echoes the same description. Both understood that what bound Ezekiel and Jonah had transcended secrecy. It was now declaration. From that night forward, no villager entered the hollow. The roads grew over. The fields lay fallow, and the Dunham estate became a fortress of silence. But silence can conceal more than absence. It can mask preparation. Margaret closed her entry of 1895 with words that still curdle the blood. The boy has become mirror of the man. The bride is not merely stolen, but her blood continues in that child. If this be true, then we stand not at the end, but the beginning of something that shall outlast all graves. By 1897, Hickory Hollow had become a place of avoidance. Maps of the county ceased to mark its roads. Travelers, if they strayed too near, spoke of sudden fogs that obscured direction, of hearing bells toll in the woods. Though no church stood there, it was said the hollow belonged not to the county, not even to Arkansas, but to something older, something that used Ezekiel Dunham as its steward. The boy, Jonah, was 9. Yet in speech he carried the cadence of an elder. Those who glimpsed him described a face pallid yet unlined, his gaze that of one who had already measured the world. Ezekiel walked beside him, stooped yet vigorous. Their steps always matched. Together they were less father and son than twin figures, shadows bound, one feeding upon the other. Dr. Leland's journals, now nearly illegible from shaking hand, recorded his final visits. He spoke of a household where time did not behave. I entered at dusk, but within the house the lamps glowed as though it were midday. Clocks chimed hours that bore no relation to my own watch. Jonah stood in the hall, reciting numbers backers, his tone even, his eyes unblinking. Ezekiel urged me to listen, saying the boy was tracing lineage not by blood but by sequence. Leland confessed unease, for each number Jonah spoke struck him as both calculation and curse. When he attempted to silence the boy, Ezekiel laid a hand upon his arm, and the physician felt his pulse stutter, as though his heart obeyed the patriarch's will. It was in that year that Margaret Henley gathered what courage remained. Her letters reveal a determination to unmask the Dunhams through written testimony, to preserve evidence even if no court dared act. One entry, penned in March, remains the most damning. I have learned through a surviving maid that Ezekiel compels the boy to recite his lineage each night, naming both mother and father as one. The boy repeats it without protest. They call it unity, but I name it devouring. In this manner, they erase the dead son, the stolen bride, until all that remains is Ezekiel eternal, his name clothed in flesh that is both his child and his mirror. Her writings echo Leland's, though she was far less measured, far more desperate. By midsummer, disappearances multiplied. A tanner on the outskirts of the hollow vanished while delivering hides. A school teacher, who had spoken against Ezekiel, failed to return from Sunday walk. Their bodies were never found. Whispers claimed their voices were heard among the Dunham chants, syllables bent into prayers no Christian could claim. One night in August, the villagers awoke to a glow upon the horizon. It was the Dunham estate burning bright as a pyre. Men gathered with buckets, women wept in relief. But when dawn came, the house stood untouched. Not a timber charred, not a window cracked. Only the smell of smoke lingered, heavy upon the fields. Dr. Leland, in a letter never sent, wrote, I fear I have misunderstood the scale. This is no mere crime of lust or inheritance. It is doctrine practiced in secret, inherited in silence. Ezekiel believes the son is vessel, the bride but soil, and the father seed eternal. They sow themselves generation upon generation, until blood is no longer mortal but alloyed with something beyond measure. Jonah is not heir, but continuation. He ended the letter abruptly, scrawling, "If I persist, I shall be taken too." After that his records cease. In October, Margaret vanished. Her brother found her journal hidden beneath floorboards, entries running to the day before. The final page bore only a line repeated thrice. The father is the son is the father, the bride is the gate. She was never seen again. Villagers at last sought to flee the hollow entirely. Families abandoned farms, leaving tools rusting in fields, bread unbaked in oven. By year's end, Hickory Hollow was a ghost valley. Only the Dunham estate remained inhabited, lights flickering at night, chants rising with the fog. A single testimony survives from that winter, written by a minister traveling west who lost his way. He claimed he was taken in by a boy of pale face and solemn manner, who offered him bread and wine though no vineyard grew nearby. At the table sat an older man, gaunt yet powerful, who spoke with voice commanding yet weary. The minister asked their names. The boy replied, "We are one." When he awoke he found himself outside the hollow, his horse tied beside him. He never passed that road again. By the century's turn, Hickory Hollow no longer appeared in county records. Ezekiel's name was unspoken, Jonah's existence denied. But in courthouse basements, in locked trunks remained the journals of Dr. Leland and Margaret Henley, fragments that scholars dispute, yet which bear too many converging details to dismiss. What became of the Dunhams no one can say. Some insist they still walk the hollow, unchanged by years, father and son both wearing the same eyes. Others believe the house fell inward, consumed by the doctrine it contained. But silence itself can be a form of survival, and the hollow has grown too quiet for comfort. The last notation attributed to Leland, though scrawled in an alien hand, reads, "I write no longer as physician, but as witness. They have drawn me into the circle. The symbols are upon my skin. Ezekiel speaks within me. Jonah mirrors my what they began shall not end with blood, nor with me. The hollow shall spread." That page was dated November 12, 1897. From that year onward, Hickory Hollow was spoken of only in whispers, a place struck from maps, but never from memory. The story of the stolen bride and the devouring father survived not through trial or scripture, but through fragments of testimony too dreadful to erase. And though the estate may have rotted, though Ezekiel and Jonah may have withered, the doctrine remained. For those who pass the hollow claim to hear chanting still, carried by winds that smell of smoke and iron. The father is the son. By 1901, Hickory Hollow was wilderness reclaimed. The paths grew choked with bramble, fences sagged into the earth, and the church bell rusted silent in its tower. No families remained, no farms endured. Only the Dunham estate stood, shrouded by trees that seemed to lean inward, as though guarding the secret within. County officials ceased their inquiries. They recorded the hollow as uninhabited, yet villagers beyond its borders swore they still saw lamplight in the Dunham windows, swaying as though carried from room to room. Hunters who strayed too near spoke of voices, low, braided, chanting not in English but in a cadence that wormed its way into the skull, and always the same refrain, "The father is the son." The journals of Horace Leland were discovered in 1903, sealed in a trunk unearthed when the courthouse underwent repairs. The leather bindings were swollen from damp, the pages warped, many entries scratched over by hands too frantic to steady. One final note, never catalogued by the county but transcribed by archivists, read, "I write this knowing my mind no longer belongs to me alone. Ezekiel's shadow falls upon my thoughts, and Jonah's gaze haunts my sleep. They have found in me another vessel. The marks upon my skin burn as though seared each night anew. They tell me the hollow is not bounded by land, nor year, nor grave. It is doctrine eternal. The bride was gate, the son was vessel, the father seed eternal. And once sown the harvest never ceases." The handwriting shifts at the last line, larger, jagged. "The father is the son." After this, the pages are blank. Margaret Henley's journal, hidden for years beneath her family's floorboards, was at last donated to a private library in Little Rock. Scholars there found its closing entry more prayer than record. "If my words be read, let them serve as warning.
The hollow is not empty. It breathes. It waits. The boy carries his father, and the father carries all who bowed before him. What was stolen cannot be returned. What was joined cannot be severed. If the hollow calls, do not answer. Margaret herself was never found. Her grave remains unmarked. Her fate unspoken. By 1910, Hickory Hollow no longer appeared on map. Children in neighboring towns knew it only as tale, a place their elders warned them never to wander. Yet objects still surfaced. A rusted ring said to belong to Clara, the stolen bride. A cracked crucifix found in the mud by a river that flowed from the hollow. Even a fragment of scorched wood bearing the faint imprint of a child's hand. Each relic carried misfortune. The ring brought fever. The crucifix blackened crops. The fragment caused a bonfire when left too near hay. In time all were discarded or reburied. But one cannot bury a doctrine. The hollow today is a place of silence, but silence itself testifies. Travelers report sudden chills, the rustle of unseen movement, the echo of laughter too low for children, too high for men. Some claim to hear the tolling of a bell long fallen. Others glimpse two figures in the distance, one tall, one small, walking in step as though bound by an unseen tether. Scholars dispute whether Ezekiel Dunham and his stolen bride ever existed as described. Records are inconsistent, censuses missing, names blurred, yet the journals remain. And though families change, though generations turn, the words persist across every account. The father is the son. It is whispered still that Jonah did not perish, nor did Ezekiel, that the father and son became mirror, each sustaining the other, until years bore no weight upon their flesh. Some believe they walk still, clothed in modern garments, moving town to town seeking new soil in which to plant their seed. For what Ezekiel began was not union but cycle. The bride was gate, but never final. Others may be taken, others may be claimed. Perhaps even, if ever you pass through northern Arkansas, and the road veers into thickets that no map names, beware the fog that rises sudden, smelling of smoke and iron. Do not listen for the chanting. Do not look for the light in the window. For if you do, you may hear the words that end all words, the inheritance that devours inheritance. The father is the son, and should you hear a child's voice, repeat it beside your own ear. Though no child stands near, leave at once. Do not turn back. Do not answer. The hollow still breathes.